if the monster you're running from lives inside your own mind? She wasn't a criminal, not a killer, not a cultist, just a 25-year-old housewife with 3 children, a marriage, and a quiet life in the English countryside. But in 1976, something inside Ruth Marie Terry cracked, and what spilled out wasn't just sadness or stress. It was something far more disturbing, something that even her doctors couldn't fully explain. Was it schizophrenia, a descent into madness? Or did Ruth open a door to something beyond reason, something that defied science and shattered reality? This isn't your typical true crime case. There's no gunshot, no missing person, no screaming headlines. What there is something far more chilling, a mind unraveling, and the terrifying question of whether it was illness, possession, or something no one has words for. Ruth began to pull away from her own children, not slowly but sharply. She dreaded the sound of them waking up. She hated the air in the room when they were near. And when her youngest, 15-month-old Yvonne began to cry, Ruth felt the overwhelming urge to lock the child in a room and run. That's not the Ruth her family knew, and that's what makes this story so haunting. The house grew quiet, dirty, unkempt. Not because Ruth didn't care, but because she couldn't. Visitors terrified her. Her own reflection became alien. Her thoughts weren't her own anymore. What was happening to her? Was this the slow corrosion of the human mind? Or something darker, something that reached into her from a place no doctor could diagnose? Tonight on True Crimes by Dominic, we're diving deep into a case that doesn't just blur the line between mental illness and the supernatural, it obliterates it. This story will crawl under your skin, because if this could happen to Ruth, a seemingly ordinary mother just trying to hold her life together, then maybe it could happen to anyone. Before we begin, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We drop chilling new true crime stories every single week. And tell me in the comments, do you think this was a medical breakdown? Or something unexplainable? Something beyond science? Because the further you go into Ruth's story, the harder it becomes to tell where the illness ends and the horror begins. This is True Crimes by Dominic. Let's begin. There was a time when the sound of a knock at the door was just that, a knock. But for Ruth, it became something else. A trigger, a jolt of terror that electrified her spine. Her body would freeze, heart pounding, convinced someone was coming for her. And the fear didn't end at the threshold of her home. It followed her into the world. Crowds became unbearable. Just walking through a supermarket felt like suffocating in a coffin of noise and strangers. Panic clawed at her throat until she stopped going out altogether. The outside world turned into an unpredictable battlefield, and her home, once a place of comfort, became a prison of shadows and silence. Her husband, Paul, tried to reach her. They had been married for 8 years, and for a long time things had been good, safe, familiar. But even that began to slip. When they were intimate, Ruth would flinch. She couldn't explain it, only that every touch left her feeling violated, not loved. Something inside her had shut down, and she couldn't turn it back on. Paul felt it. The distance, the silence, the heaviness in the air that used to be laughter. Ruth withdrew from everyone. Friends stopped visiting, not because they didn't care, but because she couldn't bear to see them. And slowly, guilt crept in. Not the kind of guilt that passes with a conversation. This was deeper, rooted in shame, self-loathing, and a belief that she had failed as a wife, a mother, and a human being. She stopped eating. Everything made her nauseous. Her weight dropped rapidly. Her eyes looked sunken, her skin pale. She was disappearing before anyone could save her. Then came the dreams. The first ones were terrifying enough. Ruth would wake up, paralyzed in bed, unable to move a muscle. It felt real, too real. A tingling sensation would rise from her toes, crawling up her body like electricity. And just as it reached her mouth, she would scream. Blood would pour from her lips, splashing across the walls, painting her bedroom in crimson terror. These weren't just nightmares, they were war zones. And they came every time she closed her eyes. So Ruth stopped sleeping, or tried to. She would sit up at night trembling, fighting exhaustion, anything to avoid the torment that waited for her behind her eyelids. But then, the dreams got worse. Her father started appearing. To understand the terror Ruth was living through at 25, we have to go back to when she was just a little girl, when the real nightmare began. Her father was a violent alcoholic, in and out of jail, in and out of her life. There were days he was sweet, almost gentle. He'd smile, offer her candy, tell her stories. And then there were the other days, the days he drank, the days the monsters showed up instead of the man. And then came that night. Ruth was 10. She woke to the sound of the door creaking open. Her father stepped into her room, not as a parent, but as a predator. What happened next shattered her. It was a brutal, life-altering assault. And when she told her mother the next day, desperate for protection, for comfort, her mother didn't believe her. Worse, she silenced her. She told Ruth to never speak of it again because if anyone found out, her father would go to prison. Then, as if the betrayal wasn't enough, her mother kicked her out of the house. 10 years old, alone. Ruth bounced between temporary shelters until she was placed into care where she would remain for the next 7 years. Life in the system wasn't kind. She fought. A lot. The other girls were just as broken, just as angry. But Ruth carried something heavier, not just pain, but a feeling that she'd been discarded, forgotten. And even during those years, her father did vanish. He showed up. He tried to kill her. Once he fired a gun at her, the bullet missed her head by inches. Another time, he followed her to the care home and tried to run her down with his car. The man who was supposed to protect her had become the boogeyman in real life. And now, all those memories were bleeding into her dreams. Ruth began dreaming of being 10 again, reliving the trauma, the same cold breath, the same footsteps, the same unbearable touch. But what truly broke her was what happened when she woke up. She turned to her husband lying beside her, only to see her father's face staring back. It was a hallucination. She knew that, a common psychological phenomenon where remnants of a dream linger just for a second. But for Ruth, these hallucinations didn't fade. They started crossing over into her waking life. She could be sitting at the table with Paul, and suddenly, just for a blink, he'd become her father. The same eyes, the same smirk, the same terrifying presence. And then came the most disturbing moment of all. Her baby, Yvonne, just 15 months old, cried out in the night. Ruth rose from bed, still groggy, still shaking from another nightmare. She walked to the crib, bent down, reached out to pick up her child. But when she looked into Yvonne's face, it wasn't Yvonne. It was him, her father's face, laughing, mocking her, drowning out her baby's cries. Ruth froze. Her arms wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, not from the dream, but from the horrifying feeling that reaching out to comfort her baby would mean touching him. That somehow the evil had infected everything she loved. That was the moment Ruth realized she couldn't fight it alone anymore. She reached out for help and began seeing a psychiatrist. Dr. Morton Schatzman. It was the first step on a long, painful road toward understanding the deep psychological damage that had been festering inside her for years. A journey that would soon lead to even darker revelations. Dr. Morton Schatzman had seen a lot in his career. Decades in psychiatry had taught him to separate delusion from disorder, psychosis from trauma. And yet, when Ruth walked into his office, haunted and trembling, something about her case unsettled even him. He reassured her first, as any good doctor would. "You're not going crazy," he told her gently. The hallucinations, the night terrors, the ghostly presence she claimed to see, they were all symptoms. Deep trauma, lack of sleep, and emotional isolation can twist the brain into terrifying shapes. But it was treatable, that was the key. Treatable. Ruth wanted to believe him. But as the days passed, her grip on reality continued to loosen. What began as flashes of her father's face in her dreams, and in others, soon evolved into something much darker and more persistent. She said it felt like she was never alone. Even when her home was silent, even when the doors were locked and Paul was asleep beside her, she felt watched. a constant pressure in the air, a presence that trailed her from room to room, always just out of sight, but heavy, so heavy in the atmosphere. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just anxiety. She knew who it was, her father. Now, if you're watching this and starting to think, this sounds like a haunting, you're not alone. But here's the twist. Her father was still alive, very much alive, thousands of miles away, living in America. There were no reports of him dying, no funerals, no ghosts. And yet Ruth was convinced whatever this presence was, it was him. Then, things escalated. One morning, Ruth got out of bed like usual and made her way to the dining room. She stopped cold. There he was, her father, sitting at her table, casually drinking coffee, looking as real as the chair he sat on. He looked up at her and smiled. That mocking grin, the same one from her childhood, the one she never forgot. He raised his coffee cup like he was toasting her. Ruth's first thought was, he must have come here. He must have flown in, found the house, broken in. But the logic didn't add up. He had no money for a ticket, no passport, no warning. Just there. Ruth bolted into the bedroom and shook Paul awake. Together, they rushed back into the dining room, but there was no one there. Just an empty chair, no coffee, no man, no trace. Paul looked at her with concern, but Ruth, she still saw him, sitting there, still sipping, still waving as if to say, I'm not leaving. I'm inside now, and only you can see me. From that moment, her father's apparition became a permanent figure in her world. He wandered through the house like he belonged there, smoked invisible cigarettes, sat on the couch, opened and closed doors. No matter what Paul said, no matter how often he insisted the house was empty, Ruth still saw him. And she started to believe what anyone in her position would fear the most. She was losing her mind. Dr. Schatzman decided it was time to take a different approach. He arranged for Ruth and Paul to spend some time at the Arbor Center, a facility designed for people suffering intense psychological distress. The idea was simple. Take her out of the house, let her rest, reset, maybe even rebuild. A family friend looked after the kids, but peace didn't come. On the second day he returned. The apparition of her father reappeared, now inside the Arbor Center, a place she had never associated with him before. She tried to ignore it, but the terror was overwhelming. She felt hunted, convinced that he could harm her, even though she knew it wasn't real. She imagined him shoving her into traffic, grabbing a kitchen knife, stabbing her as she bathed. The hallucination had grown so intense, so real that it left her hysterical. She would sob uncontrollably for hours, unable to function, unable to breathe. Schatzman was troubled. He'd worked with schizophrenics, with the psychotically deluded, but Ruth didn't fit the mold. She knew these weren't real people. She wasn't fully detached from reality. She could describe the hallucinations as hallucinations. She just couldn't stop them, and that made it worse. He feared that simply medicating her would do more harm than good. Ruth needed something else, something deeper. So in a bold move, Dr. Schatzman asked her to confront the vision. The next time she saw her father's apparition, he encouraged her to speak to it, to demand that it leave, to take back control. At first, Ruth couldn't even look at it, let alone speak. But gradually, session by session, she found fragments of strength. She began to whisper, then say louder, "Leave, go away, you don't belong here." The figure would taunt her, laugh at her, tell her, "You can't get rid of me, you're stuck with me forever." But then slowly something shifted. When she told it to go, it would stand up, walk away, leave the room. It wasn't instant, and it didn't happen every time. But for the first time in years, Ruth felt like she was taking control. Eventually, she and Paul returned home. Her hallucinations continued, but now she fought back. When her father appeared in the bathroom, she told him to leave. When she heard him pacing down the hallway, she challenged it. Even when she couldn't see him, but could smell his odor lingering in the air, she confronted the phantom. And the more she practiced, the more power she gained. Then something even stranger happened. She realized she could summon hallucinations, not just push them away. She could choose who appeared, her husband, her best friend, even Dr. Schatzman himself. They would appear before her, solid and interactive, acting just like their real-life counterparts. One time as she bathed, she hallucinated her friend walking into the room, squeezing toothpaste onto a brush, placing it on the sink and leaving. She saw the blob of toothpaste, the dent in the tube. But when the vision faded, the toothbrush was back in its holder, the tube untouched. Her mind had painted reality with precision. She began to use these apparitions as company. If Paul was working late, she'd summon him. They'd talk, sit together, laugh. And then, something more disturbing unfolded. She realized she could become the hallucinations. She began entering these apparitions, stepping into their minds, feeling their thoughts, emotions, fears. She conjured the image of herself as a child and, through that apparition, unlocked memories she hadn't accessed in years. In one powerful therapy session, Dr. Schatzman asked her to create the image of her father and then enter his mind. It was horrifying, but it allowed Ruth to experience her trauma from a new perspective. Whether or not it reflected reality didn't matter. It gave her the emotional tools to confront what had been buried for decades. Now, everything I've described, as shocking as it is, remains within the realm of extreme psychological experience. But then, things started to happen that even science couldn't explain. One afternoon, Ruth and Paul were home, and Ruth summoned an apparition. At that very moment, their Cocker Spaniel suddenly began barking wildly, snarling at the thin air. The dog jumped, growled, ran in circles as if it could see something Ruth had imagined. It didn't stop until minutes after the vision had vanished. Coincidence? Maybe. But then came the car incident. Years later, Ruth returned to America to see her father in person. One afternoon, the two of them were walking back to her parked car. The car was up the street, parked under a tree. Ruth decided to test something. She conjured up the hallucination of Paul sitting in the driver's seat. Then casually, she turned to her father and asked, "Do you see anyone in the car?" He looked, nodded, and said, "Yeah, looks like a ghost, don't it? Looks like a man, just like Paul." Ruth's blood ran cold. Her father, who had no way of knowing about the apparition, saw exactly what she was seeing. Was it possible that he too could see what she imagined? Could shared hallucinations be passed genetically? Turns out, he could. He admitted to her that throughout his life, he'd seen things that weren't their people. Shadows, full-bodied visions. "I could tell you things that'd make your hair stand up," he said, "but you'd think I was crazy." So maybe, just maybe, the darkness haunting Ruth wasn't only from trauma. Maybe it was something deeper, something inherited, a gift or a curse. And then, the most compelling moment of all. Ruth and Paul were home. Paul was in the kitchen. Ruth sat quietly near the front door. They were chatting across rooms, nothing unusual. Then Paul stepped into the room, looked at her, and froze. "You were just on the sofa," he said. "How'd you get over there so fast?" She blinked. "What position was I sitting in?" He described it perfectly, the way she would tuck her feet under herself on the couch. Ruth hadn't moved. She hadn't been on the sofa. She whispered, "That was my apparition. I created her while I was talking to her in my mind." Paul had just seen her double. A figment, but real enough to fool his eyes. So now I ask you, if a hallucination is powerful enough to leave a scent in the air, a dent in a couch, a reaction in a dog, or be seen by someone else entirely, is it still just in the mind? Or have we crossed into something else? Something far more terrifying? Paul was unraveling. Whatever wall he had built around his sanity, it had begun to crack. "I think I'm catching your hallucinations," he told Ruth one night, pacing the room like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. "It's rubbing off on me." Ruth tried to calm him, insisting gently, "That's not possible." But her words felt thin, weightless against the thick air of dread that now hung over their home. He didn't believe her. Not entirely. Not after what had happened that night in bed. Paul had reached out to her in the dark, brushing his hands along her arms, her face as if trying to confirm that she was real. that the woman lying beside him wasn't some distorted shadow of Ruth or something else altogether. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice cracked and unsteady. She laughed, trying to lighten the moment. "Can't you tell?" But he didn't laugh. He looked haunted. He made her swear on their marriage vows that she would never again appear in the room like that. Whatever that was, just after 3 a.m., he shook her awake and made her promise all over again. The fear in his eyes wasn't just fear of losing her, it was fear of losing himself. Ruth later shared this strange episode with Dr. Morton Schatzman during one of their sessions. The psychiatrist, always careful not to lead or suggest, decided to follow up. He called Paul directly, and Paul confirmed every word of it. The apparition, the touch, the vow, it all happened. But how? Was it just stress? A hallucination shared between two people bound by love, trauma, and sleepless nights? Was Paul so emotionally entangled in Ruth's suffering that he'd started seeing ghosts of her mind in their bed? Or was it something more? Could Ruth's emotional projections born from years of torment and repression be strong enough to bleed into someone else's reality? Was this the mind's way of externalizing pain? Or was it something darker? Something we can't explain? Dr. Schatzman, despite his extensive training, didn't have a solid answer. He leaned towards psychological explanations, trauma, hallucinations, the blurred boundary between dream and waking life. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he admitted quietly that Ruth's case defied easy understanding. Telepathy, thought forms, residual energy, possession. He couldn't say yes, but he also couldn't say no. And then, just like that, the story seemed to slow. 2.5 years after her first visit to Dr. Schatzman, Ruth appeared to find something like peace. The Ruth who had once lived in constant fear, who had starved herself, lost sleep, and trembled at the sight of her own child, had transformed. She wasn't haunted anymore, at least not the way she once was. She had learned how to manage the apparitions. In fact, she even claimed that she could summon them at will if she wanted, like turning a page in a storybook she no longer feared. She had reclaimed control, or so it seemed. Her relationship with Paul stabilized. Their home quieted. She smiled more. The weight began to return to her frame, and her eyes no longer looked like they belonged to someone hiding in a war zone. But then, she vanished again. Not in the literal sense, but from public record. From all accounts, Ruth slipped back into ordinary life, beyond the reach of headlines or case studies. No interviews, no updates, no further reports. Just silence. What became of Ruth after that remains one of the lingering mysteries of this story. There's no trace, no closure. As if after surviving the storm, she stepped into a private peace, one we can only hope was real. And that's where we're left. Dr. Schatzman wrote about her, documented the strange, twisting journey of a woman who turned trauma into specter and lived to tell the tale. His accounts form the foundation of everything we know about her. But even he, the man who walked through that darkness with her, admitted that some questions may never be answered. What was happening to Ruth really? Was it trauma? Was it mental illness? Or did something crack open that we're not ready to understand? It's easy to look at stories like this and file them away as curiosities, the brain playing tricks, memories leaking into nightmares. But sometimes, just sometimes, they feel like warnings. From the shadows of our past, we carry ghosts, and if left unresolved, they follow us into the future. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Ruth's experiences were purely psychological? Or did she cross into something else, something we can't fully explain? If this story made you feel anything, confusion, sorrow, fear, even just curiosity, I'd love to hear from you. Drop your thoughts below, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to True Crimes by Dominic, hit that bell icon, and give this video a like. It helps more than you know, and it lets us keep sharing these haunting human stories with you. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and remember, the scariest monsters aren't always found in the dark. Sometimes, they're sleeping beside us.